I know a lot of people know you because of this case, but for those who don't know you as a person, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my lawyer in the first hearing described me as a boring suburban dad, and I think that that's honestly a pretty decent summary. I live in Oak Park, where I live with my wife and my 2 kids. I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old. My 11-year-old plays baseball. My 6-year-old loves theater. I ran for village board in Oak Park on a platform of making our streets safer for biking and walking. My son and I almost got hit by a car once when we were picking up a pizza, and it became a passion of mine. How can we start to rethink our streets for the fact that everyone's driving around distracted? And so that's really sort of what my focus has been in Oak Park, on a lot of sort of the small municipal issues, infrastructure. How can we try to create efficiencies and do so in a way that sort of recognizes our Oak Park values.
Were you born and raised in Oak Park?
No, I was raised in the DC area originally, but after law school, my wife and I wanted to be close to her family to raise a family, and we ended up buying her grandparents' house in Oak Park. So my kids are going to the same schools that my mother-in-law went to when she was growing up. So I wasn't born and raised in Oak Park, but we have a long family history there.
Okay. How did you make the decision to begin protesting what we saw in Midway Blitz last fall?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this for me started with the fact that migrants had been bused here from Texas in 2023. And Governor Greg Abbott, who had been busing migrants here, was now offering to send the National Guard to Chicago after the very migrants that he had sent here. And Oak Park did a lot of work around helping support that immigrant community who was coming to our nation seeking a better life. And so for me, and I think for all of us, we wanted to protect the substantive rights of our immigrant neighbors. We saw due process violations for our immigrant neighbors, and so the first thing I did when I went out there that morning was I tied the due process clause of the Constitution to the gate right outside the ICE detention facility. And we sort of kept that same spirit throughout this case that followed, because the conspiracy charge against us was a charge that's looking to criminalize the freedom of assembly that's protected in the First Amendment. And so we fought on that. The grand jury transcripts issue is a fundamental right in the Fifth Amendment to actually have a fair grand jury process. And so we fought to protect that. And so all of these fights are fights that are bigger than us, because it wasn't me who was being prosecuted by the state. It was our right to stand up for each other, our right to stand up and protest on fundamental grounds of decency and what's right.
So your work in Oak Park connected you to some of the people that had newly arrived.
I don't know whether any of the individual folks that we helped in Oak Park ended up being
you understood the struggle
ICE.
that people were going through.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that for me, one of the things that gets lost a lot when we talk about immigrants in our community is there is no one who believes more in the American dream than people who walked hundreds or thousands of miles fleeing the worst conditions to come to America to build a better life for their families. And so what's happening on a national level, and what was happening here last fall and what's happening again this summer, is, I think, a travesty. And it goes against our America American values. I mean, what a way to celebrate America at 250, rounding up people who believe more strongly in America, the American dream, than anyone else. And so I think that it's vital, and it's part of my American values. It's part of my Oak Park values to stand up for our immigrant neighbors.
When you think back to that day, walk us through how you learned of the charges against you, what happened leading up to that moment.
I got a call from an FBI agent who told me that I had been indicted and that I had to self-surrender, or they would send agents to my house to arrest me, which I thought it was a scam call at first. I thought, it must be someone like trying to get personal information, and then I did some Googling to confirm that the person was who they said they were, and then I called a lawyer. I mean, I never would have thought that federal felony charges would come from an officer driving his car into a crowd, no lights, no warning, and certainly if charges would be brought, I wouldn't think it would be against the people that officer hit.
Take us back to that scene where the charges stemmed from. What happened?
We were walking back and forth across a crosswalk, and singing protest songs. I think just moments before we had been singing a song that's based out of a psalm, and is a protest song that had been sung in the labor movement and in the civil rights movement, and again here last fall, when an agent drove his car into a crowd of people walking across a crosswalk. And I think a lot of us sort of reacted the same way you would if a car hit you in a crosswalk here downtown. We turned and put our hands on the hood of the car. It was a chaotic scene. It was scary. It's something I'll certainly never forget. But usually when a car drives into a crowd of protesters, it isn't the protesters who have charges brought against them. And so I would love to hear an announcement at some point that charges have been brought against the agent who chose to drive into a crowd of protesters.
Okay, so you get this call from the FBI agent, and then you find yourself in this group of 5 other people who you didn't know up until that time. Is that correct?
That's correct. I had never met any of my alleged co-conspirators until I was going in to get a mugshot taken at FBI headquarters. I met one of them there, and I met the others at my arraignment in early November. So that was certainly strange for me. And so when I talk about the conspiracy charge being an attack on our First Amendment right to assembly, the only thing that was the foundation of this conspiracy charge was the idea that we were all in the same place doing the same thing. And that's not a conspiracy. They termed it a spontaneous and implicit conspiracy, but I don't understand how there can be any agreement amongst us when I don't actually know any of these other people. I didn't communicate with them. All I did was, when a car drove into a crowd, turned and braced myself against that car.
Was this a weaponization of the Justice Department?
I think it would be hard to term it anything else. And so it's been a bit interesting hearing the Trump administration talk so much about a weaponization of the Justice Department previously, when what they're complaining about is people breaking into the Capitol building and assaulting officers who suffered real injuries. And oftentimes those individuals were convicted or pled guilty, and they're saying it was weaponized against those folks. Here, what you see is a protest and a car driving into that protest, and as a result, we were brought up on federal felony charges, and us and our families were put through the ringer for 7 months over walking across the street and singing songs.
Those 7 months had to have been grueling for you and for your family. 7 months you'll never get back. Can you explain to folks that might not understand what that experience was like? Wait.
Yeah, I think the things that immediately come to your mind is the cost of the legal defense, and it was costly. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars for each of us, because you're preparing for a multi-week trial which had up to 7 years of prison time associated with it. But what you don't necessarily think about is my 6-year-old on the playground getting questions from her classmates about whether her dad is going to go to jail. Mm-hmm. We had a threatening call a few weeks after the indictment was unsealed, and we had to leave our house while that call was investigated. And my 11-year-old had dreams, had nightmares about whether our house would be shut up. And my wife and I had to think about and plan for what would happen if I wasn't going to be around to help out. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard, and it takes a mental toll. You can't sleep, you can't keep your routines, and you're at a moment's notice coming downtown for a new court hearing in what was a really sort of constant, unexpected, a case with constant, unexpected twists. Mm-hmm. We never really knew exactly what was going to happen next.
The grand jury situation was, I think, it's captured a lot of people's interests because it played out in such a astounding way.
Yeah.
Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, we started requesting the grand jury transcripts last December, and we asked prosecutors for them. We asked the court mm-hmm. to allow us to review them, or at the very least for the court to review them. And we were in our pre-trial hearing just a week before trial was set to begin. And my attorney, Chris Parenti, asked the court again, can you please just take a look at the unredacted transcripts? And the court responded, it's just 15 to 30 lines, it's probably just IT issues. Mm-hmm. And so a week before trial, we were still full steam ahead, planning on going to trial. And then on that Wednesday before, an order drops that any assistant U.S. attorney who touched these transcripts was to be in Judge Perry's courtroom that Thursday morning for a sealed hearing. And at that sealed hearing, we learned that it wasn't just 15 to 30 lines, and it wasn't just IT issues. Mm. Instead, it was some of the most egregious prosecutorial misconduct the court had ever seen. And over the course of the last few weeks, those transcripts have actually been released to the public, and folks have had an opportunity to see that. And
what made it egregious?
There are a bunch of different kinds of prosecutorial misconduct that happen in those transcripts and that layer on top of each other. Mm. There's vouching, where the prosecutor says, you can trust me, I wouldn't bring a case unless it was just. There's excusing grand jurors. There are all of these big and little kinds of misconduct that built up to an unjust case ultimately being indicted. And, I'm really proud of these Chicago grand jurors who looked at the case and said, this case is a crock. This case isn't a case that should be charged. But they asked, do you get unlimited tries? And the prosecutor ultimately didn't say no. And so after these same grand jurors had been faced with this same case 3 weeks in a row, ultimately they returned an indictment. But I can't say that they returned the indictment because they actually had a change of heart and believed in the case. I think that when you have all of these forms of misconduct layering on top of each other, and these grand jurors believe that they're going to be living in a Groundhog's Day until they return an indictment, it's not surprising that indictment would come. But these grand jurors saw what was actually happening. They said, well, wouldn't the right thing for the agent have to do be to stop the car? Would it be okay if I ran into somebody because they stood in front of my car? And ultimately, the prosecutor told them to ignore their common sense, to ignore those questions, and just return in an indictment. And that's what happened.
When you saw the text of the transcript, and Judge Perry's reaction, was that validating?
It was shocking and horrifying, because if this kind of misconduct is happening in a high-profile case like this against defendants like us, I'm afraid of what might be happening in other cases where there are defendants who don't necessarily have the resources to push for justice every step along the way. Here, the prosecutors had to know that this was a group of defendants who would stand up for themselves and their community in the courtroom the same way we were standing up for our neighbors outside the Broadview ICE detention facility. And I think that what we've seen since those transcripts have been released has been the Northern District of Illinois acknowledging a crisis of credibility in this U.S. Attorney's Office flowing from that fact. If this kind of misconduct was happening in this kind of case, where else is that kind of misconduct happening in front of the grand jury? And should the U.S. Attorney's Office have any presumption that they're going to do the right thing?
Charges against you and the other defendants were all dropped, but there were still lingering effects of this case. What happens next for you?
Yeah, we won this case, but we haven't yet achieved justice. There's, I think for me, I have throughout this case been seeking to do justice as a verb and not just seek justice as a noun. And what that means is we need to find accountability and transparency. We need to continue to learn who knew what when and how high the cover-up went, because the misconduct in the transcripts is just the tip of the iceberg. The bigger issue is, after that misconduct happened, this U.S. Attorney's Office redacted it, withheld pages, and did everything in their power to prevent the judge from seeing the unredacted transcripts. They didn't want transparency and accountability. And that's what we've continued seeing. In another unrelated case, they just dismissed charges related to hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud because the U.S. attorney and others in his office could have been called to testify in an evidentiary hearing. All of us were willing to take the stand and tell our truth about what happened on September 26th. But right now, our U.S. Attorney's Office is unwilling to have the kind of transparency and accountability that can lead to real justice.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think people need to know? Loaded question, but I always ask it.
I think it's really important to recognize the community that stood with each of us, because I was out there on September 26th standing up for my immigrant neighbors, and I've continued to try to stand up for my community, and in turn my community has stood with me. And I think that's important, because one of the goals of this kind of prosecution is to make each of us afraid, to make us afraid to stand up. And I hope everybody takes away from this that if you stand up for your community is going to stand up for you and with you. And when we all stand up together, we win. And that's what happened here.